Just because something is a classic doesn't mean it's good. Some shitty bands do pave the way for others, but is that because they were actually good, or were they just giving a glimpse of what's possible? And at what point are bands, products, and people famous for being famous instead of actually having done something? Also Glock, also 45, but not the song. That's actually the only 45 I like. However, some things are classic because they absolutely withstand the test of time. No matter how much time passes or how old you get, Pulp Fiction, Snoop Dogg, and grilled cheese are always going to be good. Things can be good within their own niches, but for something to be good or great, it should transcend its genre. It should bring fans in that might not have considered that genre before. I mean, even people who don't like rap at least know who Snoop Dogg is. And Attack on Titan is the greatest anime ever because you don't actually have to like anime to get sucked into it. So where does that leave the 50mm lens? Is it kinda washed up? Or is it the champ it once was and still deserve respect? Without a doubt, the 50mm is best in a prime lens. Now, if you bring a little bit of photography experience to the table, you might have heard this lens be referred to as a normal focal length. It's considered normal because its magnification, distortion, and compression are all very similar to what your eyes actually see. So if the human eye is 1x, then the 50 adds just a few tenths to that. There tends to be very little distortion or barreling, and the 50 compresses background objects very similarly to how your eyes do. The result is a very natural or normal image because it approximates how your eyes actually work. 50 is considered normal on 35mm film or a full-size sensor, and different formats or sensor sizes are going to have different focal lengths that are considered normal. This is why on like an APS-C or a crop frame sensor, closer to like a 35mm lens would be considered normal, because the 35 gives a field of view that's very similar to the 50, without the slight magnification that the 50 has. The 50 does some things very, very well, which is why it carries with it the notoriety it does. At wider apertures, it has, hands down, the best depth of field and separation than any lens wider than it, which leads to an incredibly smooth bokeh. And smooth bokeh really is the only thing that gives value to a photographer, just like gamers and their RGB and desert LARPers with their kit. Also, 50mm lenses tend to be very light, very affordable. They aren't too wide or too close, and they tend to blur backgrounds very nicely. And typically with LPVOs, barrel lengths, women, there's compromise in everything. But the 50mm is the focal length with the least amount of compromises, hands down. But what if those compromises don't necessarily come from its performance, but rather its artistic expression? The 50mm takes some incredible, natural, lifelike images, but what if your life is boring and you still have to drive to the job you hate because society won't hurry up and collapse? On paper, the 50 might make you feel like you won't ever need another lens until you start considering your shots from a more artistic standpoint. So am I saying that the 50mm is kind of boring and their other focal lengths can do the exact same things but better and with more personality? Yes, that's exactly right. So in my mind, the 50 sits right in between two other focal lengths that have way more character. The 35, which is on the zoom lens I'm recording on, and the 85. Now, looking specifically at portraiture, street photography, landscape, and product photography, I think either of these other two lenses bring way more to the table. The 85mm is going to give you way better background separation and compression, making almost any backdrop look so creamy and beautiful. The tighter field of view on the 85 also eliminates tons of distractions, making even like a busy street or parking lot the perfect setting for some portraits. It also very slightly compresses people's faces front to back. It makes for a little bit more of a flattering look versus the distortion on some wider lenses, which kind of pull the face apart front to back. And then the 35, which is my favorite focal length for portraits, provides a much more contextual portrait, bringing in more details about your subject, their surroundings, and even what they're doing. At wide apertures, the 35mm has a pretty decent depth of field. It's not going to be as smooth and creamy as the 50 and definitely not the 85, but you can also fit multiple subjects or people or just a bigger scene in the frame with a 35. Out on the street, the 85mm snipes people. Your subjects almost never realize you're photographing them, which leads to way more candid shots. And this focal length really lets you capture things as you're watching them unfold, since people tend to act a little bit different if they know a camera's pointed at them. An 85mm is great at isolating specific details about objects, cars, buildings, people, versus photographing those objects as a whole. The 85 is definitely a little more introverted out on the street, and it kind of puts off a vibe of, I'm just here to take pictures. I don't necessarily like people. 35mm street photography lives in its entirely own world. That's a photography topic that really deserves its own video. There's so much that goes into taking pictures of people up close in the street. I mean, it forces you to talk to people, to meet them, to take an interest in them or whatever it is they're doing. I mean, it's gonna be very apparent when you come up to somebody about this close and ask to take their picture. But a fast, open aperture 35mm lens can take very mundane people and details and turn them into works of art. It's great at showing how your subject fits into the scene and their surroundings as a whole, instead of just isolating them. As far as landscape, it's almost completely a wash. Any focal length can produce amazing images of landscapes. 85mm is going to bring further objects and details closer in. 35 captures wider horizons, obviously wider shots. And the 50 kind of just sits really comfortably right in the middle. As far as product photography, I actually think your minimum focus distance is way more important than the focal length of your lens. So for products that are smaller or that have a lot of detail, a macro lens that will let you focus at much shorter distances from whatever subject you have is going to be much more important than the focal length. I would actually say that of the three, a 50 is probably the better one if you don't have a macro lens. 50s will probably have a closer minimum focus distance than an 85, which again, if it's not macro, you're probably just gonna crop in anyways. And a 35 can be okay for the up close shots. It's probably just gonna let in more detail than you want it to. But for any other product, stuff that's not gonna be on a table or in a box, things like clothing, shoes, guns, plate carriers, chest rigs, helmets, night vision, belts, or a 35 to highlight some of the more specific details. The 50 kind of sits in the middle. It can do both of those things fairly well. But once you start thinking about a specific product, a specific person or scene, and how you're going to get those images, you have way more artistic tools at your disposal with a 35 or an 85. So should you just throw out the 50 or use it in a torture test video? I would say either of those are fine. However, while I much prefer the other two focal lengths, I do think there are some best use cases for the 50mm. For starters, it's a stellar upgrade from your kit lens. I mean, anything is really. So if all you have is your kit lens and you're feeling frustrated because your pictures don't look good, go get a 50mm and you're gonna find out that it's not your camera that sucks. It's just you and your lens that suck. I also think the 50 is good for video. It's not too wide, it's not too close. Really kind of a 35 or a 50 would be great for filmmaking or reels or whatever. And I think at least for my specific use case, the 50 shines the most in product photography with the good depth of field, the smooth bokeh, being able to get a lot of out of focus elements in a foreground, the closer minimum focus distance, coupled with the more lifelike perspective from a normal lens. At least for me, that's where I end up using a 50mm focal length the most, is with products. And I think out of anything you can say about the 50, the biggest benefit it has is how versatile it is. I mean, you really can take your 50 out and capture image for pretty much any type of photography. Of course, it's not going to do it better than other focal lengths that are just more specialized to different types of photography, but it's fine. I mean, the 35, the 85, they tend to be a little more artistic. I think they have more character to them, while the 50 is just dependable. I think absolutely everybody should buy a prime lens and only shoot with that for months on end. That way you can get really, really good at just taking pictures, because you're not necessarily going to be thinking about, I should have had a different lens, or should I be zooming or not. You're only going to be thinking about what's the best image I can make with the tools I have on hand. And you're not going to get trapped in the gear chase. I mean, it happens with guns and kit and all that stuff all the time. Something new comes out and you think that's going to be the thing that's going to elevate my skills to the next level, when it's not. It's probably just hard work and practice. That's exactly my background with the 50mm, and it might be why I feel like it's kind of elementary, a little vanilla, because for honestly years, 50mm was the only thing I shot. I'm not necessarily saying that the 50mm prime is a beginner's lens. My 50s get fairly good usage, but even with the inherent trade-offs of the other two focal lengths, I feel like I'm missing out on less if I only have one of those other two. There have been too many times where I've wanted to go wider or go in a little bit tighter with a shot with just my 50, and I feel like I was missing out. Whereas with an 85mm, I just already know that I'm not going to be looking for wide open scenes to capture. So mentally, I'm visualizing all of my shots just a little bit differently with this. Or with the 35, I know that I'm going to be going up to people, talking to them, or just getting wider angles of broader scenes. I mean, I can happily walk past a wide street scene if all I have is my 85, because I just know I'm looking for a different type of image. But fairly often, if all I have on me is my 50, I'm seeing a little bit of both, and I end up wishing I had a better suited lens. Something that did one thing a little bit better versus doing a lot of things kind of okay. But here's the biggest thing, and this is kind of what it comes down to. If you don't go out and practice or train with your camera and lens, you're just gonna suck. It's the same thing when it comes to shooting guns as cameras. The gear itself doesn't really matter if you know how to use it. And while I have my artistic issues with the 50, it's a lens that most photographers aren't going to outshoot. I've talked to other people in person or online about images that I've liked, and plenty of people take pictures with a 50mm focal length that I end up liking. So just like all the carry guns you have for all the different weather patterns, and your 6 slightly shorter or longer ARs, all of those are just tools that are probably more capable than you are. So go pick a lens and just go shoot. But I'm probably not picking up the 50.